Hello everyone. Our presentation today is called the Aesthetic Debate, and we'll talk about three important topics. The first one is a movement called aestheticism. The second one is a representative in Britain of this movement, Horatio Pater. The third part is another representative, but this time a novelist. His name is Oscar Wilde, and the work is a very well-known one, The Picture of Dorian Gray. So let's move on to the first topic, to the so-called aestheticism, which is also the aesthetic movement, and to its representative, Horatio Pater. The aesthetic movement took place sometime at the end of the 19th century in Europe and in Britain as well. You probably remember that very much of Victorian literature was associated with the moral value, with the fact that what was taken into consideration was the capacity of a work of art to teach, to be moral, to show moral values. The aesthetic movement was a reaction against this, because they said that literature, or art in general, didn't have any such goals. What counted this time was the aesthetic values of a work of art, more exactly, its beauty, and not the facts, let me say it again, that it had any political, didactic, or any social importance. So, at the center of this movement was the idea of beauty, the concept of beauty, what it actually meant to be beautiful. And what it meant to be beautiful was being beautiful, if I can say it, or more exactly, as they said it, the principle was that art for art's sake. Art only existed for itself. Art never existed for any other purpose. So please keep in mind that we deal with a European movement, but because we're interested in Victorian England, we'll be talking about Horatio Pater and Oscar Wilde as the most important names associated with this movement. Here we have a picture of Horatio Pater. And Horatio Pater wrote a work called Studies in the History of Renaissance, which is a very interesting work in which he studies the most important artists of the Renaissance. But what counts for us is not so much the studies of the Renaissance as its conclusion. Because its conclusion, Horatio Pater was of the opinion that what counted was the sensuous experience, was the activity of the senses, the fact that we had to take all of these elements into consideration to enjoy beauty, beauty which he associated with different works of art of the Renaissance, but which, at this time, in this conclusion, he associates with our real life. According to Horatio Pater, to be able to enjoy the present movement, we had to enjoy every moment, to take into consideration every sensation that we have. We have to live every pulsation, as many pulsations as possible, as he said. And let's try to read a fragment from the conclusions of the Renaissance. To burn always with his heart gem-like flame. To maintain this ecstasy is success in life. In a sense, it might even be said that our failure is to form habits, for after all, habit is relative to a stereotyped world, and meantime, it is only the roughness of the eye that makes any two persons, things, situations seem alike. While all melts under our feet, we may well grasp at any exquisite passion or any contribution to knowledge that seems, by a lifted horizon, to set the spirits free for a moment, or any stirring of the senses, strange dyes, strange colors, and curious odors, or work of the artist's hands, or the face of one's friend. Not to discriminate every moment some passionate attitude in those about us, and in the very brilliancy of the gifts some tragic dividing of forces on their ways, is on this short day of frost and sun to sleep before evening. With this sense of the splendor of our experience and of its awful brevity, gathering all we are in one desperate effort to use and touch, we shall hardly have time to make theories about the things we see and touch. What we have to do is to be forever curious, testing new opinions, and courting new impressions. So let me say it again. What is very important is to enjoy every day, every short day, and in the meantime, to test our opinions, to court new impressions, to rely on the activity of our senses, to enjoy life as much as possible. The name of this concept is, of course, hedonism. Now, the aesthetic movement was represented in several arts. Here we have two examples, two paintings. One is by Walter Crane, and the other one is by William Morris. If you look at them, you see that the lines have very special curves, very special forms. What we rely on is what we find in nature, like, for instance, beautiful animals, like, for instance, flowers or leaves. This movement, which started at the end of the 19th century, was very soon to impose itself in the arts under the name of Art Nouveau. Art Nouveau was the cultivation of nature, the beauty of nature, the beauty of the representatives of nature in everything that surrounded us. But unfortunately, we do not have the time to talk about this. So let's try to talk about a very interesting writer. His name is, as you can see, Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde was a very prolific writer. He started by writing poems, and the poems do carry very special lines. And it happens in a very similar way in the book that followed it, The Happy Prince and Other Tales, which is a collection of children's stories about beautiful things, about nature around us, about flowers, about noble feelings. Oscar Wilde also published a novel, a very famous one, a novel which practically is associated with his name automatically in the case of very many people. And the name of the novel is The Picture of Dorian Gray. For a lot of people, if you say Oscar Wilde, you say The Picture of Dorian Gray. And if you say The Picture of Dorian Gray, you say Oscar Wilde. But of course, he was also important for a collection of short stories, very interesting ones, Lord Arthur Saville's Crime and Other Stories. But another domain in which Oscar Wilde is a very important writer is his comedies, very special comedies, boudoir comedies, comedies of situation. Because what counts in this case, in the case of these comedies, is the very special language, sparkling dialogue, very witty conversation, aphorisms. So practically the text of these comedies is the one that give the spectator this idea of enjoyment. One of these comedies is Lady Windermere's Fan. The other one is A Woman of No Importance. He continued with An Ideal Husband, and practically the comedy that is automatically associated with his name is The Importance of Being Honest. Oscar Wilde's life was not a very happy one, in spite of the fact that he preached the enjoyment of every moment. He did have a lot of problems in his life because he was accused of homosexuality, and the result of that was that he was sent to jail. So the works that you see now, The Ballad of Reading Gaol and De Profundis, are directly associated with the period that he spent in prison. So, what shall we keep in mind? We keep in mind the fact that Oscar Wilde is the promoter of the doctrine of art for art's sake, that he is a very keen, he is a very diligent follower of Pater, and we can say that he learned Pater's lesson very well. Some people say that he learned it too well because he practically applied to real life this idea of enjoyment of life, this idea of hedonism, that his idea was to enjoy every moment of the life around him. And the result is, as I told you, the fact that he had problems with his justice, with the English system of justice. So Oscar Wilde can be associated with this spirit of the fin de siècle, this idea of disappointment, this idea that you have to find satisfaction so much in what is associated with the world around us as seen through your senses. And of course, as I told you, Oscar Wilde did this in very many cases, as it associated with pleasure. And we have in De Profundis, one of the works that he wrote as a result of the period that he spent in prison. And he wrote about this. He wrote about his life. It is some kind of a confession, as the whole work is like that. I used to live entirely for pleasure. I shunned suffering and sorrows of any kind. I hated both. I resolved to ignore them as far as possible, to treat them, that is to say, as modes of imperfection. They were no part in my scheme of life. So here you have his confession. I lived entirely for pleasure. This is the moment when we can say that he showed himself as probably the keenest follower of Pater. And then another fragment of his disillusionment, another fragment from one of his creations, a very, very long confession, the Ballad of Reading Gaol. in which he confesses the negative aspects of life, the negative aspects of love. Yet each man kills the thing he loves. By each let this be heard. Some do it with a bitter look, some with a flattering word. The coward does it with a kiss, the brave man with a sword. Some kill their love when they're young, and some when they're old. Some strange with the hands of lust, some with the hands of gold. The kindest use a knife, because the dead so soon grow old. Some love too little, some too long. Some sell, and others buy. Some do the deed with many fears, and some without a sigh. For each man kills the thing he loves, yet each man does not die. And now let's move on to his most important creation, according to very many of his critics. It is the novel The Picture of Dorian Gray. The Picture of Dorian Gray has a very rough and interesting publication history, because at the beginning it was published in installments, and the first time it was published complete was in Lippincott's magazine. You can see a picture of the Lippincott's magazine on this slide. And at the time when it was published in this magazine, it had about 13 chapters. But the edition was an expurgated one because certain passages that were considered very vicious, offensive, he had to remove. The novel was condemned because they said that it was against all rules of morality. Of course, Wilde defended his creation. He defended his novel. But of course, he had to remove certain passages of it, to further remove certain passages, in order to be able to publish it. So this controversial material was no longer included in the new edition, which, quite unexpectedly, was longer than the first one. It contained 20 chapters, and it appeared in 1891. And it contained a preface, something very unusual in the case of a novel, which is a list of aphorisms that Oscar Wilde included as a defense of his art, as a defense of the principle of art for art's sake. Art is only for itself. Art is for nothing else. And the artist exists only to and for his art. So let's try to see a few details about this novel. Peter of Dorian Gray is not a singular creation because very many other novels were published in more or less the same period of time. One of them is Au Rebours, Against the Grain is the English title, published by Joris Carwismont. And it is the story of a man who, after having lived a decadent life in Paris, decides to move to the countryside and to surround himself with works of art, with several expressions of beauty, a collection of works of different kinds, and with the help of these objects, with the help of this art, to remember his life of decadence that he lived in Paris. So practically, it is the fact that for this young man, art, the creations of art, try to replace real life. Another creation is La Peau de Chagrin, The Magic Skin, by the French writer novelist Honoré de Balzac. The most important aspect is the fact that sometimes pleasure seeking leads to personal annihilation. It is the story of another man again, who by some chance finds a magic piece of shagreen, which is the skin of a wild donkey. And because this skin has the power to fulfill every wish that he has, he starts by asking the skin to fulfill his very unusual, sometimes very unusual vices. The problem is that with every magic trick that the skin played, it became smaller and smaller. And at the end of the novel, practically he is left without his skin and he is left without his physical energy. And then one more novel. It is published by Robert Louis Stevenson, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, where the writer speaks about two people in one and the same person, about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the good and the bad people. They symbolize the good and the bad people. And then the whole novel can be associated with the idea of divided and split personality. I told you about the preface that was included by Oscar Wilde in his novel, a very unusual thing. So I told you that the preface was a list of aphorisms that he published in order to teach his readers, his audience, and even the critics how art should be taken into consideration. Because the artist can speak about everything that he wants, about moral and immoral people, but he speaks about these aspects not in order to instruct the reader, but because this is the work of art, and he has to be responsive only to this work of art. The artist speaks about these aspects, good and bad, of real life, because he doesn't want to make any judgment. He doesn't want to say that this is good, this is bad, this is right, this is wrong. So practically, vices or virtues are just tools in the hands of the writer, not to educate, but to be used in order to show his literary creation to the public. And at the end of the preface, he says that all art is quite useless, which is to be understood that art doesn't have any utility in it, doesn't have any practical utility in it. You cannot use any art to teach anything. You cannot use your art to prove anything unless you want to show beauty, to show your creation as having aesthetic value, and this is it. So here is a list of some important aphorisms. Let's have a look at them. The artist is the creator of beautiful things. This is a very interesting definition of the artist. So practically what he does is that he doesn't teach a moral lesson, but creates beautiful things. That to reveal the art and conceive the artist is art's aim. So what counts, what we have to take into consideration is the creation itself, not the artist, not the life of the artist, not the actions of the artist that happened behind this work. There is no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. Books are well written or badly written, that is all, he says. So again, don't talk about any moral lesson that has to be associated with the books. The only thing that we have to take into consideration is the aesthetic value. And from this point of view, the books can be good or bad. The aesthetic value that they transmit can be well transmitted or wrongly transmitted. And this is all that we have to take into consideration. And here he says, no artist desires to prove anything, even things that are true can be proved. So you don't want to prove, you don't want to demonstrate everything in your creation. You just give the creation to the public without your without you being behind the work in order to prove a point. No artist has ethical sympathies. An ethical sympathy in an artist is unpardonable mannerism of style. So you cannot show as artist that you like one thing or to like another thing. This should be an exaggeration, a mannerism, as he said. So you don't have to have any ethical sympathy in the case of a novel. There is one thing that we don't talk about when we talk about a novel or a poem or anything like that. No artist is ever morbid. The artist can express everything. So don't be shocked that you read about one horrible thing or another one, and you can see this in the case of modern literature, because the artist is free to express everything. The only thing, the only entity he is answerable to is his mind, his conscience. We can forgive a man for making a useful thing as long as he does not admire it. The only excuse for making a useless thing is that one admires it intensely. The only excuse for making a useless thing is that one admires it intensely. So practically, you don't have to take into consideration anything which is useful. And if you want to make a useless thing, just admire it. And then all art is quite useless. The one we actually started with, the aphorism we actually started with. The novel contains several characters, but let me only talk about the most important ones. One of them is Dorian Gray, and the main hero of the novel. The other one is a painter. His name is Basil Hallward. And the third one is Lord Henry Wotton. We'll talk about them in a moment. But let me show you what Oscar Wilde said about these three characters. Basil Hallward is what I think I am. Lord Henry is what the world thinks of me. Dorian is what I would like to be in other ages, perhaps. And Sybil Vane, one of the very few feminine characters in the novel. As I told you, the novel is made up of several characters, but now we have to take into consideration three of them. So here you see a triangle, so practically the most important character, the one that gives its title, is Dorian Gray. And the other two characters are Lord Henry on the one side and Basil Hallward on the other. So practically the novel consists of the relationship that the two people developed as far as Dorian Gray is concerned. I told you about hedonistic philosophy of Pater and the fact that Oscar Wilde continued it. And he continued it by placing this kind of philosophy inside Lord Henry, because Lord Henry's mission in the novel is to determine Dorian Gray to accept this, to accept pleasure and to enjoy pleasure at all cost. So not to have second thoughts, to do it very actively. Basil Hallward is a painter, as I told you, but he was the voice of reason. He was the voice of society because he uh, does have some special but sound conceptions about life. The fact that the artist is an artist, but he also lives according to the rules of society, and he has to observe these rules of society. The novel begins with a very interesting quotation. The quotation happens in the garden, uh, in Basil Hallward's garden, and it takes place when Lord Henry perceives Oscar Wilde for the first time. So here he begins his conversion, to convert Oscar Wilde to this life of pleasure seeking. And he tells him, "Some day when you're old and wrinkled and ugly, when thought has seared your forehead with its lines, and passion branded your lips with its hideous fires, you will feel it. You will feel it terribly. Now wherever you go, you charm the world. Would it always be so? You have a wonderful, beautiful face, Mr. Gray. You have only a few years in which to live really, perfectly and fully. When your youth goes, your beauty will go with it, and then you will suddenly discover that there are no charms left for you, or have to content yourself with these mean charms that the memory of the past will make more bitter than defeats. Realize your youth while you have it. Don't squander the gold of your days, listening to the tedious, trying to improve the hopeless failure, or giving away your life to the ignorant, the common and the vulgar. These are the sickly aims, the false ideas of our age. Live, live the wonderful life that is in you. Let nothing be lost upon you. Be always searching for new sensations. Be afraid of nothing." So the essence is that now that you're young and beautiful, enjoy this beauty while you have it. And enjoy it by living life to the full, by enjoying every moment. Live this wonderful life and accept everything. Be always searching for new sensations. This is, of course, Pater. Be afraid of nothing. The result is what Dorian Gray does with a painting. Because the picture of Dorian Gray is a painting made by Basil Hallward, a painting which records Dorian Gray in his youth as being a very beautiful young man. And at a certain moment, when his conversion, when Lord Henry's conversion is on good tracks, Oscar Wilde will have a look at his portrait, and his idea will be, why do I have to change my face, my body? Can I not stay young forever? Can I not stay like that and let the picture record the changes of this life on my face? And this is, of course, a magic trick, because this is exactly what happens. So, after that moment, the entity that will stay young forever will be Dorian Gray. and the entity which will change with the life of debauchery, with the life of consumption that he lived, is of course the painting. So Lord Henry Wotton is the preacher of these doctrines. He is practically the devil incarnate because his only aim is to convert, to corrupt Dorian Gray. And the moment Dorian, decides to ask the painting to replace himself is like having signed a pact with the devil. It is a Faustian pact. It is a pact that he signs with Lord Henry, so we can consider that Lord Henry Wotton is the devil itself. And then the pact with the devil is just like in the case of Dr. Faust, to stay young forever. So that's what is going to happen with the portrait. So Lord Henry will have low conversations with Dorian Gray, and every moment he tries to mold his personality, to make him aware of the sensuous manifestations, to enjoy every moment of his life to the detriment of other people, to pay no heed, to go as easy and merry-go-lucky as he wanted, paying attention to nothing. At a certain moment, Lord Henry Wotton gives Dorian a book, a yellow book, a book that will never be revealed to us, the readers, but a book that Dorian Gray will use like a Bible, a sort of a manual teaching him what exactly he has to do, and of course, leading him to his life of corruption, sin and evil and debauchery that will, of course, um, lead him to his tragic end. Important character in the novel is Basil Hallward, the painter. Basil Hallward paints Dorian Gray because he's fascinated with his personality. He is attracted in him. And this is the case when very many critics saw a kind of very special friendship, a kind of homoerotic relationship, or a relationship with homoerotic overtones. So Basil Hallward cannot have this kind of permanent relationship with Dorian Gray, but he can have this permanent relationship with the beauty of Dorian Gray, which he records in his painting. So uh, they will stay forever for a certain period of time. But when Dorian takes his life very ad literam, when Dorian Gray tries to live his life to the full, according to the Yellow Book and according to the lessons that he was taught by Lord Henry, Basil Hallward realizes the fact that life cannot be lived like that. I told you that he was a sound man, according to whom he was answerable to society. And this is the moment when their roads diverge. Basil Hallward will return later on. And the moment he returns, he will find Dorian Gray, and Dorian Gray will show him the painting, the hideous painting, because don't forget that the painting received onto itself all the corruption, all the evils that um, uh, Dorian Gray committed. So this is the moment when Basil tries to tell Dorian Gray to convert back, to get back to his original innocence. The result will be very tragic because Dorian Gray will stab Basil Hallward and he will throw his body into the River Thames. The novel has a tragic end because at the end of the novel, Dorian Gray realizes the fact that life, after all, cannot be lived like that. Life, his life was practically the life of the portrait. He has to return to real life, and this is the moment when he realized the fact that he had been so sinful that he started regretting it. And this is the moment when he decides to stab the portrait, the painting, in order to destroy any traces of corruption on this painting. And this is the moment when he himself grows old and very hideous, and when the painting returns to its original beauty. Art is beautiful. Art has to be beautiful till the end. And Dorian Gray dies as an old and ugly old man. Now, in the case of the novel, we do have some other topics of debate. So first of all, we have to talk about certain symbols. One of them is the portrait. The portrait which is replacement of real life. The portrait which is the representative or the representation of beauty. But the portrait cannot stay like that forever. The portrait in a way works like a mask. And here we have another symbol. A mask behind which the real sinner, the corrupt person tries to hide. The mask is beautiful, the portrait is beautiful, but behind is the ugly man, being ugly as a result of the life that he lived. And then another symbol is the mirror that practically shows you the way you are. And sometimes the mirror is also the um, um, threshold from this world to the other one. And let us not forget the Yellow Book. The Yellow Book is the book of corruption, the book that practically was the printed matter that corrupted Dorian Gray. So practically all of these symbols, the portrait, the mask, the mirror, and the Yellow Book are the symbols of corruption, the symbols that practically led to the transformation of Dorian Gray from the innocent man that he was to the decayed old man that he finished as he finished at the end of the novel. Let us not forget the Faustian Pact and the fact that we have a pact with the devil, with Lord Henry. And the result of this pact is the fact that you give something, you give your innocence, you give your correct life for permanent youth. But of course, the result is very tragic. Let us not forget hedonism, which was preached by Pater, and the fact that hedonism is this enjoyment of every moment of live life to the extreme. But of course, we have to be very careful with it, and we have to take into consideration every moment that reason has to be behind it. And reason, of course, is something which does not exist in our case. We do have homoerotic attitudes in the novel, and these homoerotic attitudes are the ones that created problems for Oscar Wilde, for the fact that he exhibited love for another young man. The result of that was that he was sent to prison. It was the 19th century. We do have homoerotic attitudes in the case of the painter Basil Hallward and of course Dorian Gray. But of course these are not directly shown. Don't forget that the novel had to be published in the 19th century. So in order for the novel to be published, certain passages had to be removed. And let us not forget that we do have a Gothic romance. We have a romance of love, but we have this kind of hidden life, this kind of uh, dark aspects of life dark aspects of conscience. We have unexpressed moments of our life. We have killings, we have murders, and we have moments when what predominates is the dark side. It is the lack of light that we have to take into consideration. Now, the picture of Dorian Gray was also made into a film, um, and I don't want to refer to the film, but for a lot of people, the film is the one that can be associated with the picture of Dorian. So here you have the three main characters: Dorian Gray, Lord Henry Wotton, and Basil Hallward. So you have the lefties, Ben Barnes, who played Dorian Gray. Maybe you're familiar with the film. Colin Firth, a very important British actor who played Lord Henry Wotton, and Basil Hallward, who was played by Ben Chaplin. And the film was directed by Oliver Parker, quite successful, in 2009. Well, where the darker sides, where the horrific aspects, even the homoerotic attitudes are a little bit more insisted upon, of course, to make the film more visible. Now I'm going to play for you a short fragment from this film. With this, my presentation is over. Thank you very much for your attention.